Gavin Newsom walked into that committee room believing he was stepping into a standard political skirmish to defend his crisis management. But Vice President JD Vance only needed one name, Rachel Dervish, to completely dismantle a 30-year political career and expose the fatal cost of bureaucratic silence. As someone who has spent decades navigating the treacherous, labyrinthine corridors of public office, reading the internal tracking polls, managing the inevitable crises, and understanding the intricate, often unforgiving machinery of state and federal government, I can tell you with absolute certainty that political destruction of this magnitude rarely happens in a single chaotic explosion. It happens meticulously, deliberately, and quietly. It happens document by document, memo by memo, and silence by silence. We all watched it unfold on national television, a breathtaking masterclass in political accountability that systematically stripped away the polished, carefully constructed veneer of executive privilege and laid bare the raw, undeniable consequences of administrative negligence. The governor of California, the man overseeing the fifth largest economy on the planet, a leader who had just managed 40 million people through the absolute worst natural disaster in the history of Los Angeles, walked into that congressional committee room expecting a standard, manageable political debate. He anticipated a discussion on crisis management logistics, armed with well-rehearsed talking points about deploying the National Guard, coordinating extensively with FEMA and CAL FIRE, and directing massive state resources. He had the confident posture of a seasoned executive who had already survived the relentless hammering of previous inquiries, including a highly publicized mechanism hearing with former President Trump and an earlier grueling session with Vance himself. But he was fundamentally unprepared for the surgical precision of a prosecutor who understood a fundamental truth of governance. True political failure is not found in the unpredictable chaos of a raging fire, but in the quiet, unread documents that sit on a desk in the long, complacent months before the first spark is ever struck. The polished exterior of the California governor, that campaign-ready composure that had weathered countless electoral storms, was visibly degraded from the moment he took his seat. He sat at the witness table carrying the heavy, burdened posture of a man who had already been broken and rebuilt by the brutal mechanisms of previous hearings, yet remained fundamentally diminished by the ongoing process. The tailored suit was immaculate. The signature campaign hair was perfectly placed, but the face beneath them had profoundly changed. It belonged to a leader who had been plummeting in presidential tracking polls, residing at a devastating -5 for 60 consecutive days. He was a man watching his carefully constructed political legacy burn to the ground with the exact same terrifying helplessness as the residents of Pacific Palisades who had watched their homes turn to ash. Across the wooden dais sat Vice President JD Vance, wearing a dark suit with no tie, projecting the quiet, dangerous, and absolute calm of a man who had meticulously done the reading. He did not open his thin, meticulously tabbed folder right away. In the high-stakes theater of political hearings, you do not start with the dry paperwork. You start with the human cost. Vance deployed a deliberate, devastating tactical maneuver designed to immediately strip away the protective armor of government statistics and multi-billion-dollar budgets. He invoked the name Rachel Dervish. She was not a political rival, she was not a corporate lobbyist, and she was not a partisan operative. She was a mother residing in Pacific Palisades. For 3 years, she had driven her daughter down Marquez Avenue every single morning to a local school. On January the 9th, 2025, that school, along with her entire neighborhood, her neighbors, and her entire life's foundation, was completely incinerated in a span of just 4 terrifying hours. Vance did not need to read from his detailed notes to describe what happened in the tragic aftermath. He spoke entirely from memory, utilizing a tone that those of us in the political arena recognize instantly: the Middletown Register, the voice of a leader speaking directly to the heartland, remembering a living, breathing person rather than presenting a sterile government document. He painted the scene vividly for the committee members and for the tens of millions of Americans watching the broadcast at home. Following the absolute devastation of the fires, Governor Newsom visited the smoldering ruins of the Palisades. It was a standard, highly choreographed political maneuver that every executive has executed. The imposing motorcade, the advance team buzzing with earpieces, the heavy security detail, and the carefully positioned cameras capturing the solemn, empathetic walk through the rubble. But Rachel Dervish was there, standing in the literal ashes of her daughter's school. When she saw the governor's SUV rolling through her ruined neighborhood, she ran desperately toward it. She screamed for him, crying out that she lived there, that the charred, unrecognizable remains before them used to be her child's classroom. And the governor, the chief executive elected to protect her, picked up his mobile phone, feigned a loss of cellular signal, closed the heavy, armored door of the vehicle, and instructed his driver to pull away. It was a visceral moment of profound abdication captured by news cameras, a 21-second clip broadcast by Sky News that had already been viewed 60 million times across the globe. 60 million people had watched a sitting governor retreat from the raw, unscripted pain of his own constituent. In the hearing room, as the vice president recounted the event, you could observe the severe physical toll of that memory manifesting on the governor. His jaw tightened. As a politician, I know that tightening well. It was not the defiant clench of a debater preparing a counterattack. It was the involuntary physiological response of a human body remembering a profoundly damning moment. It was the physical memory of the SUV, the acrid smell of the ashes, the desperate sound of the woman's voice, and the heavy, final thud of the door closing on her reality. But Vance, employing a masterful and ruthless pivot, made it explicitly clear he was not there merely to discuss bad political optics or a viral video clip. The political theater of the fleeing SUV was just the visible symptom. The underlying fatal disease was buried deep within the state's administrative paperwork. Vance finally opened his thin, tabbed folder and withdrew a document obtained through a public records request directly to the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. It was an internal infrastructure assessment dated June 2023. That was exactly 18 full months before the catastrophic fires swept through the Palisades. The vice president read the chilling, highly technical language of the assessment aloud for the official congressional record. It explicitly warned that the current reservoir levels in the Santa Monica Mountain Service Zone were operating at a dangerously compromised 62% of their minimum fire flow capacity. The report bluntly and unequivocally stated that in a multi-point fire suppression scenario within the hillside residential zones, the current water infrastructure would be wholly insufficient to maintain adequate hydrant pressure for sustained operations exceeding 4 hours. At this precise moment, Newsom's right hand moved to the edge of the table, not gripping, but pressing the slow, involuntary compression of fingers against wood that begins when a human body decides it desperately needs an anchor and the table is the only thing available. Vance turned the page, his voice steady and relentless. He noted that this critical assessment had been formally forwarded to the Governor's Office of Emergency Services on July 14th, 2023. Electronic metadata had definitively confirmed its receipt. It sat directly in the governor's official system. Vance then delivered the procedural death blow. He asked a breathtakingly simple question. What action was taken in response to this dire infrastructure assessment? He set the document down on the wooden desk. The answer, he revealed with devastating clarity, was absolutely nothing. There was no emergency reservoir replenishment authorized. There was no temporary water storage deployment initiated. There was no infrastructure upgrade authorization signed. There was not even a basic fundamental communication dispatched to the local fire departments, warning them of the severely reduced hydrant capacity. For a year and a half, the warning lay completely dormant in the bureaucratic ether. And when the fierce, dry Santa Ana winds finally howled through the canyons and the hillsides erupted in an unstoppable inferno, the brave firefighters rushed to the scene in Pacific Palisades, connected their heavy hoses to the municipal hydrants, and found absolutely nothing coming out. As a politician analyzing this exchange, I can tell you the strategic architecture was flawless and absolutely lethal. Vance was not just accusing Newsom of making a miscalculation in the heat of a rapidly unfolding crisis. He was accusing him of a profound, systemic, and deadly negligence. He then pulled a second document from the folder, twisting the political knife even deeper into the administration's credibility. It was a committee-obtained copy of the advance team briefing for the governor's January 10th visit to the Palisades disaster site. Every high-level politician relies implicitly on advance teams. They script our days, they manage our sight lines, and they tightly control our environments to project strength and empathy. This specific briefing explicitly noted that displaced residents, including families who had lost their entire homes within the previous 24 hours, were currently present at the Marquez Avenue location. The document coldly identified approximately 15 to 20 displaced individuals on site and officially recommended routing the governor through an eastern access point to strictly maximize visual media coverage while deliberately minimizing unscripted interactions. Minimizing unscripted interactions. That is the sanitized, soulless, bureaucratic terminology for actively avoiding the very people your government has failed. This was the undeniable smoking gun of political choreography, prioritizing visual optics over basic human empathy. Rachel Dervish was not an accident of timing or a failure of perimeter security. She was a categorized risk that the administration had actively plotted to avoid. She was placed in a category of people who might have difficult questions, people who might be highly emotional, people who might scream. When Vance pointed this out, he brilliantly contrasted the sterile language of the governor's political operatives with the stark, bleeding reality of human suffering. He noted that in Middletown, Ohio, where he came from, they have a very different word for driving away from a grieving mother standing in the ashes of her daughter's school. They don't call it minimizing an interaction, they call it leaving. At this point, the knuckles on the governor's right hand, pressing hard against the edge of the witness table, turned completely white. The grip was much harder now. This was not a theoretical debate about abstract homeless spending or complex unemployment fraud data. This was about a grieving mother in ashes being reduced to an unscripted interaction to be managed, minimized, and discarded for a political photo opportunity. The systematic deconstruction of the administration's narrative continued as the vice president shifted his intense focus to the governor's grandest political boast, a massive $2 billion state fire prevention budget. Newsom had touted this staggering number endlessly. He had promoted it on national cable news networks, highlighted it at self-congratulatory press conferences, and plastered it proudly across a state website titled California Fire Facts. He claimed to have increased the state's fire budget tenfold, from $200 million before he took office to $2 billion now. But Vance brought the cold, hard, unyielding receipts of forensic government accounting. He presented the committee's exhaustive categorization of every single dollar of that highly publicized $2 billion total. The breakdown was a masterclass in exposing the grand illusion of government spending. A massive 82% of the budget, equating to $1.64 billion, was allocated strictly to fire suppression. This covered the heavy equipment, the CAL FIRE personnel staffing, the expensive helicopters, the massive tanker trucks, and all the machinery required to fight fires only after they had already started and were actively threatening lives. Another 7%, totaling $140 million, was swallowed entirely by administrative overhead, office expenses, and the sprawling bureaucracy of fire management. That left a meager 11%, just $220 million, dedicated to actual proactive fire prevention. This was the critical, life-saving work that stops fires before they start. The aggressive brush clearing, the controlled burns, the critical vegetation management. Vance hammered this mathematical reality home with rhythmic, punishing precision. For every single dollar the governor proudly claimed to spend on fire safety, only 11 cents actually went to preventing the inferno from reaching Rachel Dervish's daughter's school. 82 cents went to fighting the blaze only after it had already arrived. Newsom desperately attempted to interject, leaning into his microphone to argue that the vice president's characterization did not accurately reflect the administration's comprehensive approach to wildland fire management. But his voice was immediately swallowed by the relentless, quiet cadence of the interrogation. In the brutal, unforgiving arena of a high-stakes congressional hearing, an unfinished sentence is a completely lost battle, not interrupted by loud volume, but denied any oxygen by the sheer unyielding persistence of the prosecution. The interrogation then waded deeply into the treacherous waters of regulatory paralysis, specifically focusing on the California Environmental Quality Act, universally known as CEQA. As anyone who has worked in state governance knows intimately, a weaponized, inflexible bureaucracy can be just as deadly as a natural disaster if left unchecked by strong executive leadership. Vance revealed that the single most effective tool available to fire scientists and land managers for preventing catastrophic wildland fires, controlled, prescribed burns designed to safely eliminate accumulated highly combustible fuel, was completely paralyzed by state red tape. The committee's investigation had uncovered that the average wait time to secure a permit for a simple controlled burn was an agonizing 14 months. It took 14 months of navigating endless environmental reviews just to get legal permission to clear the dry brush that would ultimately take only 4 hours to burn a vibrant community to the ground. The Pacific Palisades zone, nestled in the high-risk Santa Monica Mountains, had not seen a single controlled burn in over 7 years. That meant 7 long years of dead vegetation, dried leaves, and brittle timber stacking up on the hillsides like kindling, just waiting for a single spark. Vance detailed the tragic, profoundly frustrating history of permit applications for that specific area between 2019 and 2023. 3 separate, desperate attempts were made to protect the community. The first application was outright denied following a legal challenge by an environmental advocacy group, citing the potential disruption to the natural habitat of the coastal California gnatcatcher, a small local bird. The second application was trapped in administrative delays for 11 months, forcing the frustrated applicant to finally withdraw the request because the safe designated burn season had already passed. The third attempt was approved in principle, but the final authorization miraculously arrived in August, completely outside the safe weather window for burning. By the time the next appropriate season rolled around, the hard-won permit had officially expired, and the entire agonizing process had to be restarted from scratch. 3 desperate attempts over 7 years resulted in absolutely zero preventative action. The brush grew thicker, denser, and drier, sitting on the hillsides above the schools, above the homes, and directly above Rachel Dervish's street, like a loaded weapon waiting for a match. Vance then read harrowing, undeniable testimony directly into the record from a veteran CAL FIRE battalion chief, a man who had spent 23 years fighting wildland fires on the perilous front lines. The chief testified that the firefighting community had been begging for prevention funding for as long as he had been in the service. They knew exactly what worked: controlled burns work, aggressive brush clearing works, and creating defensible space works. But the state fundamentally refused to fund prevention. They only funded the chaotic response after the fact. And the chief explicitly warned that by the time a fire starts in dense, unmanaged fuel conditions like those found in the Palisades, combined with high winds, the fire simply cannot be fought. It can only be survived. Vance looked directly at the governor and translated this catastrophic institutional failure into a devastating moral indictment. The very men and women paid by the state to fight the fires were publicly stating that they could not fight the infernos the governor was failing to prevent. They were begging for just 11 cents more on the dollar to clear the brush, and they were being told by the administration that an environmental review process originally designed to protect nature would simply not allow them to clear the fuel that was actively killing citizens. The visual of Governor Newsom during this specific segment was deeply telling and politically pathetic. His famous composure, whatever remained of it after the grueling previous hearings, labored heavily. His shoulders, usually set in the confident, broad posture of a man who believed he was destined for the presidency, rolled forward in a visible physical withdrawal. It was not merely a slump. It was the undeniable body language of a politician retreating from the overwhelming weight of empirical data, sinking backward into his chair because the front of the chair is where the data lands, and the back of the chair offers 1 inch of physical distance from the horrific reality of his own governance. In Vance's home state, if a building is a known fire hazard, the fire marshal condemns it immediately. He doesn't wait 14 months for an environmental study. He doesn't file 3 applications over 7 years. He acts decisively because human lives matter vastly more than bureaucratic process. Under Newsom's failed leadership, a coastal California bird had more rigorous state protection than Rachel Dervish's daughter's school. But the final pillar of Vance's masterful prosecution was perhaps the most economically complex and ultimately the most devastating for a chief executive, the total collapse of the state's property insurance market. Before the first spark ever flew in the Palisades, before the fierce Santa Ana winds ever arrived, the state was already deeply, structurally vulnerable. 7 major insurance carriers, including the industry giant State Farm, had entirely ceased writing new homeowner policies in California. These massive corporations didn't flee the state because they suddenly stopped caring about Californians. As Vance sharply noted, insurance companies do not possess feelings, they possess actuaries. And their highly paid actuaries looked closely at the mathematical reality of California's hostile regulatory environment and concluded that doing business there was corporate suicide. Vance walked the entirely silent committee room through the administration's disastrous rate control regulations implemented in 2023. These regulations were politically designed to cap homeowner insurance premiums to keep them artificially affordable for angry voters. However, the committee's independent, retained actuarial firm proved conclusively that these regulations capped the premiums vastly below the actual mathematical cost of the massive risk. Under the governor's strict rules, the maximum allowable premium for a home situated in a high fire risk zone was heavily restricted to approximately 60% of the actuarial fair premium, the absolute minimum amount that would legally allow an insurer to approximately cover their expected catastrophic losses and remain solvent. The state had essentially ordered private companies by fiat to lose 40 cents on every single dollar of risk they insured. Faced with a draconian political mandate that made doing business mathematically impossible, the insurance giants didn't bother to negotiate. They didn't waste valuable time lobbying, and they didn't complain to the press. They simply packed up their vast capital reserves and left the state completely. The tragic, entirely predictable consequence was that the homeowners left behind by this massive corporate exodus were not seamlessly transferred to other robust private companies. They were dumped unceremoniously into the FAIR plan, California's state-mandated insurer of last resort. This plan offered significantly less coverage, demanded much higher deductibles, and carried absolutely no guarantee of actual solvency in the event of a major statewide disaster. Within 11 short months of State Farm's withdrawal, the Palisades neighborhood went from being 68% fully covered with replacement cost insurance down to an abysmal 31%. When the fire finally ravaged the community, hundreds of thousands of homeowners in Los Angeles County found themselves vastly underinsured or completely uninsured. They were financially decimated, not because they were irresponsible and not because they couldn't afford normal premiums, but because the governor's stubborn adherence to price controls had driven every viable financial safety net out of the state, making California mathematically uninsurable. Vance highlighted a particularly damning internal memo from the governor's own actuarial division. The experts inside the administration, the people whose literal job was to ensure the math worked, had explicitly warned the governor before he signed the regulations that the rate caps would inevitably result in significant market contraction in high-risk zones. That is the polite, bureaucratic translation for a mass corporate exodus. The governor received the dire warning, ignored the fundamental math, signed the regulations anyway, and made his state uninsurable right before it burned to the ground. That wasn't bad luck. That was a deliberate, arrogant policy choice followed by a devastating, entirely predictable consequence. And the ultimate human consequence of that policy choice was Rachel Dervish, radically underinsured, standing in the ashes of her life, screaming at a fleeing SUV. At this revelation, the governor's neck flushed a deep, undeniable crimson. It was the body's most reliable tell, the autonomic nervous system detecting a severe existential threat and flooding the skin with blood. It was a physiological acknowledgement of immense guilt that the heavily trained face, despite all its media coaching, could no longer suppress. The climax of the hearing was a masterstroke of political interrogation and psychological pressure. Vance lowered his voice, abandoning the aggressive, echoing volume of a typical congressional cross-examination for a quiet, intimate register that demanded absolute, unbroken attention. He methodically tied the three massive, disparate failures together into a single, undeniable narrative of executive absence. The water infrastructure memo warning of 62% capacity was completely ignored. The fire prevention budget was starved at a pathetic 11 cents on the dollar, while brush clearing permits were stalled for 14 months. The insurance market was intentionally destroyed by political rate caps that ignored basic actuarial reality. When all three of these colossal administrative failures violently converged on January 9th, the winds hit, the dry brush caught fire, the municipal hydrants ran completely dry, the homes burned to their foundations, and the financial safety net was nowhere to be found. And in the immediate aftermath of this entirely preventable catastrophe, the governor drove to the disaster site with a heavily coordinated motorcade. And when a desperate mother screamed his name from the ashes of her life, he pretended his phone didn't work and hid behind armored glass. Vance paused intentionally. In the high-stakes world of broadcast journalism and political debate, silence is a devastating weapon. He let the immense weight of the narrative settle over the room before delivering the final, fatal question. He noted that in a previous hearing regarding unemployment fraud, he had asked the governor if he had intentionally chosen the disastrous outcome. That was a question of legal intent, a prosecutor's question about what was hidden inside a man's mind, which is notoriously difficult to prove. But today, Vance stated firmly he was not asking about intent. He was asking about fundamental priorities. He looked directly into the eyes of the man who desperately wanted to be president of the United States and asked the defining question: what was more important? What specifically was taking up the governor's valuable time instead of reading the critical water memo sitting in his inbox? Where was the other 89 cents of the fire budget going that was more vital than clearing the deadly accumulated brush surrounding residential neighborhoods? What political victory was more important than keeping the insurance companies solvent and operating in the state to protect vulnerable homeowners? And finally, what was possibly more important than simply telling his driver to stop the car when Rachel Dervish was standing in the ruins of her daughter's school screaming for help? Vance brilliantly framed the question through the deeply personal lens of his own traumatic childhood in Middletown, growing up in a freezing house where the adults were entirely dysfunctional. He recounted coming home from school to a house that was not just cool, but cold, because a utility bill had sat unopened on the kitchen counter for 3 long weeks. The gas wasn't shut off because they couldn't afford it. His grandmother would have paid it. It wasn't shut off because the company was unreasonable. They would have arranged a payment plan. It was shut off because nobody cared enough to simply open the mail and make the call. The worst trauma an adult can inflict on a dependent, Vance argued, is not active abuse, but total, devastating absence. It is the failure to show up. To Vance and to the millions watching at home, the water memo was the unopened letter on the counter. The overgrown brush was the letter on the counter. The massive insurance exodus was the letter on the counter. They all sat there in the governor's office, completely ignored, until the house was no longer just cold, but reduced to smoldering ash. Vance demanded an answer to his question. What was more important? And for 12 agonizing, suffocating seconds, the hearing room fell completely, utterly silent. 12 seconds of dead air on national television is an absolute eternity. It is a crushing physical weight that suffocates the subject. The broadcast camera held tight on the governor's face. He maintained his composed mask, a skill honed over decades of intense political survival, holding his expression steady, because holding is the only defensive skill he had left. But holding a face is not answering a question. The silence screamed volumes because the question did not ask for a legal defense. It demanded a tangible list. It demanded a list of things that were legitimately more important than protecting human life. And the honest, horrific truth, the answer that hung thick and heavy in the dead air of that committee room, was that the list was completely empty. Nothing was more important. The vital memo went unread, not because a more pressing state emergency demanded immediate attention, but because of profound administrative apathy. The brush wasn't left to grow wild because funds were desperately needed to save lives elsewhere. It was left because the bureaucratic inertia of the environmental review process was too politically difficult to fight. The insurance market wasn't destroyed to save the broader economy. It was destroyed because capping premiums polled exceptionally well with voters in the short term. And the SUV didn't drive away because of an imminent security threat. It drove away because the political optics of dealing with a grieving, angry mother were deemed too messy for the evening news broadcast. The 12 seconds of silence confirmed the darkest reality of governance. The opposite of leadership isn't necessarily gross corruption, malice, or a grand scheme. Sometimes the most destructive force on earth is simply absence. It is the arrogant failure to show up, to read the documents, to do the hard, unglamorous, tedious work of governing. As Vance pointed out, doing nothing is the exact thing that allows everything else, the raging fire, the dry hydrants, the loss of 29 lives, the destruction of 12,000 structures to happen. When the 12 seconds finally broke, Vance closed his thin folder with an air of absolute finality. He stated clearly that nothing was the worst possible answer, and with that, he announced he had no further questions. When Governor Newsom finally spoke, his 3-minute and 22-second response was a masterclass in predictable, hollow political deflection. He talked at length about the macro impacts of global climate change. He referenced the unprecedented, historic nature of the extreme wind event. He praised the unquestionable heroism of the CAL FIRE first responders and the massive deployment of the National Guard. He reiterated the top-line $2 billion budget number. He even attempted to spin the viral SUV video, claiming that Rachel Dervish was a constituent he cared deeply about and that the interaction had been taken entirely out of context by the media. But as a seasoned political observer, it was painfully obvious that the governor's response was entirely about the disaster itself. Vice President Vance had spent the previous 35 minutes meticulously dissecting the 18 months of decisions that occurred long before the disaster, the choices that made the devastation completely inevitable. The unread memo, the pathetic 11-cent prevention budget, the 14-month CEQA delays, the mass insurance exodus, none of these systemic, catastrophic failures were addressed in the governor's defensive monologue. Vance did not even bother to react to the spin. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, offered a brief nod of acknowledgement to the committee chairman, and walked out of the room. He didn't even cast a backward glance at the ruined governor. The very last image broadcast by the network cameras before the feed cut was the single piece of paper bearing Rachel Dervish's name, sitting alone on the witness desk. It was not a number, not a percentage, and not a policy analysis. It was a name, a mother, a daughter, and a school on Marquez Avenue that simply did not exist anymore. The media and political aftermath of that hearing reshaped the national landscape with unprecedented speed and ferocity. In the modern era, political narratives are defined by the virality of their components, and this hearing produced 4 distinct, devastating clips that permeated every corner of the American electorate. The first clip, the 21-second split screen of Vance reading Rachel's words over the footage of the fleeing SUV, garnered a staggering 38 million views in its first 24 hours. Its power transcended partisan politics. It was a universally understood human tragedy of a desperate mother running and a powerful man hiding. The second clip, detailing the pathetic 11-cent fire prevention budget, spread like wildfire among firefighting unions and land management communities, offering profound professional vindication to crews who had spent their entire careers begging deaf bureaucrats for resources. The third clip, exposing the 60% actuarial cap and the math that made California uninsurable, finally provided a clear, undeniable answer to millions of furious homeowners who couldn't understand why they had been abandoned by their carriers. But it was the fourth clip, the agonizing 12 seconds of silence following the question, what was more important, that dealt the fatal, career-ending blow. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the governor was not just overwhelmed by a complex crisis. He was fundamentally absent from his duties. The legislative dominoes fell with astonishing rapidity, driven by the intense, undeniable public fury generated by the hearing. A joint federal and state audit of every single water infrastructure system in California connected to fire suppression was mandated within 2 weeks, the first comprehensive review of its kind in 30 long years. The narrative had permanently shifted. The fire didn't overwhelm the system. The system was known to be woefully inadequate, and the government actively chose not to fix it. The California state legislature, suddenly terrified of massive voter backlash and moving with rare, unprecedented bipartisan urgency, overwhelmingly passed the Palisades Fire Prevention Act. This landmark legislation completely bypassed the burdensome environmental red tape of CEQA for high-risk zones, instantly slashing the permitting time for controlled burns from a paralyzing 14 months down to a functional 30 days. It was the most significant wildfire prevention reform in the state's entire history, tragically named after the very community it was far too late to save. In a deeply humiliating political defeat, Governor Newsom was forced to publicly sign the sweeping insurance reform bill he had stubbornly blocked for 3 years. The new law finally allowed for risk-based pricing for homeowners insurance in fire zones, essentially serving as a signed, legal admission that his previous rate control policies were mathematically disastrous and directly responsible for the market collapse. And then the final shoe dropped. Within 60 days of enduring that brutal cross-examination, Gavin Newsom officially withdrew his name from consideration for the 2028 presidential race. His massive campaign apparatus attempted to frame the withdrawal as a noble, dedicated decision to focus entirely on rebuilding Los Angeles. But absolutely no one in the political sphere believed the spin. The brutal combination of established administrative intent and the resulting horrific loss of life had permanently disqualified him from seeking the highest office in the land. A 30-year political ascent was entirely dismantled by 2 hearings, 1 folder and 1 name. Rachel Dervish eventually testified before Congress herself in a separate hearing held 2 weeks later. She spoke for only 6 minutes. She didn't bring thick binders, complex actuarial tables, or lengthy policy analyses. She simply described the acrid smell of the smoke on the morning of January 9th, the frantic drive to a school that no longer existed, and the visceral, soul-crushing moment she saw the governor's motorcade, ran for her life, and watched the heavy SUV door close in her face. Her brief, unscripted testimony was the most watched congressional event of the entire year. When eager reporters tried to ambush Vice President Vance in the busy hallways of the Capitol for a victory lap interview, he refused to take the spotlight. He stopped, looked directly at the cameras, and stated firmly that Rachel Dervish was the only name that mattered in this entire process. He reminded the press that the unread memos in the inbox, the overgrown brush on the hillside, and the missing insurance actuaries were all just the paperwork of a massive tragedy. Rachel standing in the ashes was the reality. Everything else is paperwork. Out in the real world, far from the polished marble of Washington, the deep impact of the hearing resonated powerfully with ordinary citizens who intimately understand the daily, frustrating failures of bureaucracy. Down in Madisonville, Louisiana, men like Gerald Thibodeau watched the broadcast in a local bait shop, nodding in agreement as a customer noted that a leader who refuses to fix the levee when the water is low has absolutely no right to blame the rain when the water runs high. And in Middletown, Ohio, workers like Crystal Atkins sat in the break room of a recovery center, staring intently at the television as the 12 seconds of silence played on a loop. Crystal recognized the exact nature of the governor's profound failure. It wasn't a grand criminal conspiracy or a clever political trick. It was the simple, devastating disease of not being there. In recovery, they say the opposite of addiction is connection, being present and showing up. In governance, the exact same principle applies. The opposite of political failure is showing up, reading the mail, opening the door, and doing the job. This entire agonizing saga serves as a permanent, haunting reminder to anyone who dares to hold public office. The electorate is remarkably forgiving in many ways. They will forgive a leader who tries desperately and fails. They will forgive a leader who makes an honest mistake in the thick fog of a rapidly moving crisis. But they will never, ever forgive a leader who simply refuses to be present. When 29 people are dead, when 12,000 structures are reduced to smoldering rubble, and when a desperate mother is standing in the ashes of her child's life screaming for help, the absolute worst answer an executive can ever give to the question of what was more important is nothing.